Joining me now, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff. He is the ranking Democrat on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Congressman Schiff, thanks for being here.
It's great to be with you.
We heard from Kellyanne Conway, one of the president's advisors, moments ago. She said that Mike Flynn, his national security advisor, President Trump's national security advisor, still has the president's full confidence right now. Are you confident in the job that Mike Flynn now, and should Americans be?
No, I'm not at all. And of course, this comes on the heels of a troubled past when he was the head of the DIA. But if this is someone who can't remember whether he discussed with the Russian ambassador sanctions that the president placed on Russia that very day, that really strains credulity. It's very hard to believe. And we need a national security advisor that the president can trust, that the American people can trust. I really think it's time for him to step down.
You've said that if Mike Flynn lied or intentionally misled the vice president, that he would have to go. Have you spoken to your Republican colleague, the chairman of your committee, Congressman Devin Nunes, about possibly investigating Mike Flynn, and where does that stand right now?
We have certainly spoken about the investigation that we're doing of Russian covert influence operations in the United States. That's a bipartisan investigation in the committee, and I think this ought to be within the scope of what we investigate. Certainly, if there were contacts between Flynn as a chief surrogate for the Trump campaign and the Kremlin during the campaign, that's well within our purview. If those contacts continued after, and indeed the subject of sanctions was raised, and then Flynn was misleading about it, that ought to be something that has to be investigated.
But, Congressman, specific to this issue here regarding the conversations, the communications that may have taken place in that window after President Trump was elected but before he was inaugurated between the Russian ambassador and Mike Flynn, do you know whether the FBI is investigating, or is there any other inquiry taking place in that regard?
I can't comment on what the FBI may or may not be investigating, but I can say this. We need to request, if the FBI or any of the other intelligence agencies have recordings or transcripts of these conversations, we need to see them. We need to listen to them. We need to find out whether the National Security Advisor was misleading the public, and that ought to be something that is very easily subject to proof. In my view, that's why you haven't seen a really full-throated defense of General Flynn, because the administration understand if those recordings exist, they can't very well write them off to being fake news.
On Mike Flynn, is the bigger issue here that he may have communicated with the Russian ambassador about U.S. sanctions, or that he may have covered it up? Is it the communication or the cover-up that most concerns you?
Well, with respect to the conversation on December 29th, it's the cover-up, I think, that would be most concerning. The Logan Act violation, that statute may be very unenforceable. It's never obviously been prosecuted. If there were communications between Flynn and the Kremlin during the course of the campaign, and there was any collusion between the Kremlin and the Trump campaign, that would be the most serious allegation and mean the most serious trouble for General Flynn.
Do you have evidence that General Flynn was using encryption in these communications? You think that should be reviewed, but do you have any evidence of that?
I don't have evidence of what he used to communicate. All we know is what the administration has said. Sean Spicer did say early on that General Flynn texted the Russian ambassador. I don't know what kind of platform he may have used for that, but I think we ought to explore all the communications General Flynn had with the Russians, had with this ambassador, or had with anyone else tied to the Kremlin. And of course, it goes back at least to that dinner where he was seated next to Putin some time ago. Right. But we ought to look at the full scope of communications in any medium that General Flynn used.
Are the problems of dysfunction that you and others see within the national security apparatus right now bigger than Michael Flynn? What is your paramount concern right now about the way that national security is being handled by this administration?
Well, I have two concerns. First is the role of Steve Bannon. I think you can see a lot of his fingerprints on some of the dysfunction in the National Security Council, and it's a role he should be playing. He should not be playing with respect to the NSC. But beyond that, I think you see the influence of a president who may very well be in over his head, who begins the morning generally by tweeting things that the National Security staff then has to try to make sense of, justify, rationalize. Very dysfunctional presidency from the top on down. The NSC, I think, is only one part of the dysfunction.
So let me ask you about that. You say the president may be, quote, in over his head. Some Senate Democrats have begun to question President Trump's mental health. Let me play you what we've heard from some of them. Take a listen.
Is it true that Republican colleagues of yours express concern about President Trump's mental health?
A few. He lies a lot. He says things that aren't true. That's the same as lying, I guess. That is not the norm. for a president of the United States or actually for a human being.
We have a president who is delusional in many respects, a pathological liar, somebody who is trying to divide us up.
So do you have concerns about the president's mental health, and is that an appropriate question for Democrats or Republicans to be asking?
Well, I'm not a mental health expert, but there does seem to be a pathological quality to the fact that he cannot accept facts that are adverse to him. And to give you the best illustration, the fact that he cannot accept Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. He has to invent millions of undocumented immigrants voting. The fact that he cannot accept that the Russians helped this campaign has to deny effectively what all of the intelligence agencies were telling him week after week. That does, I think, speak to a significant problem with this president. Now, whether that has a clinical diagnosis or not, I'll leave to the experts, but I think it is more than fair to point out that this is outside the range of what I consider either normal, acceptable, certainly questionable activity. Whether it has a clinical diagnosis, I'll leave to the experts.
Congressman, last question. The Washington Post has been reporting that the dining room at Mar-a-Lago, the president's private estate, became sort of an open-air situation room on Saturday night as they were watching closely the crisis taking place in North with that mid-range missile launch. Does that concern you, the idea of an open-air situation room where citizens, private citizens, could watch?
Of course it does, as well as we don't know what documents they were examining with cell phones that may or may not have been compromised. And it's all the more appalling when you consider that this is a crowd that castigated Secretary Clinton for how she handled classified or confidential information. This is a crowd that castigated Susan Rice, saying quite falsely and unjustifiably that she had somehow misled the country about Benghazi. And here you have Flynn misleading about contacts with the Russians, and you have the president and others at Mar-a-Lago having what should be confidential discussions in a skiff out in the open with patrons. And that, of course, doesn't even get to the question of the jacking up of fees at this private country club that inure to the Trump family benefit. All of this is not exactly what I would call draining the swamp.
Congressman Schiff, we appreciate your time. Thanks very much.